Hello there, and welcome to the latest offering from the Edinburgh Fortean Society online. Normally, we would meet on the second Tuesday of every month at 7:30 p.m. in a local pub for a talk and a get together. Obviously, at the moment, we can't do that, but we are trying to keep the schedule the same. So we're launching new talks on the second Tuesday of every month at 7:30 here on YouTube. There are a number of different ways that you can interact with the Society, and our Facebook page, our Twitter account, our web page, meetup group, etc., are all listed in the description below. So please feel free to contact us through those methods, and also to see what talks we've got coming up as well. For tonight, we've got another talk that is part of the series, if you want, that we're doing of speakers we normally wouldn't get for geographical reasons. Tonight we've got a speaker from Wales. We've got Dr. Jack Hunter. Jack is an anthropologist who specialises in consciousness, religion, ecology and paranormal studies, and where those things actually meet. He's based at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and he lives in the Welsh Mountains along with his family. And he's produced a number of books, edited some as well as written chapters, written whole books. One of his latest, which he mentions in the talk, is this one. It's readily available from bookshops everywhere, so please support our speakers. And for this particular talk, what we've got Jack talking on organicism and psychical research, where mushrooms and mediums meet.
Hi, I'm Jack. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks, Gordon, for inviting me. It's greatly appreciated. I'll just share my screen so that you can see my presentation, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Here we go. Okay. So, organicism and psychical research, where mushrooms and mediums meet. This is going to be the theme of my talk for the next hour or so. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. I just wanted to say, first of all, a little bit about Charles Fort, because I was honoured to be invited to speak with you at the Edinburgh Fortean Society. I've always thought of myself kind of like a Fortean. I've always been inspired by and influenced by, publications like the Fortean Times. But as I was growing up, I also read things like Colin Wilson and all of that kind of stuff. So it was nice to be invited to talk to you. And it makes me feel like I am now an honorary Fortean as well. So thank you very much for that. But there's a lot of reasons why Charles Fort's approach is appealing, and I'm going to explain a little bit of that now. So a few years ago, I put together an edited book. It's quite an eclectic collection of essays that explores different Fortean approaches to things like religion, folklore, and the paranormal. And the idea was to explore really what a kind of a Fortean approach to religious studies might look like, or to think about whether it's possible for there to be a Fortean anthropology. So all of the chapters in the book explore this idea in different ways, and they each take this Fortean approach in different directions. So it's quite an interesting book. But it also kind of paves the way for some of these ideas that I'm going to be exploring today. Okay, so really what I want to think about is, what might a Fortean perspective bring to theorizing about things like the paranormal, but also, more broadly as well, to theorizing about things like, religion and that kind of thing. So, we need to think about what is Charles Fort's kind of key idea? What is it that he offers us? And he actually gives his approach a name, which is quite handy. He calls it intermediatism. So this is like Fort's philosophical approach to the damned data that he collected. And essentially, he describes intermediatism as a perspective, in general metaphysical terms, like a purgatory. All that is commonly called existence, which we call intermediateness, is quasi-existence, neither real nor unreal. The idea is that existence isn't something that is, or reality isn't something that is fixed and static, but actually reality is something that is dynamic, and everything really exists on a sort of a sliding spectrum between the real on the one hand and the unreal. So everything, even the things that we take for granted, tables and chairs and whatever, exists somewhere on this spectrum. So, from Fort's perspective then of this sliding scale where everything is an expression of becoming, then, there's no reason to separate off damned facts from any of the other kind of like mundane facts of about everyday lives. All of these phenomena are on the same kind of sliding scale. So this is a nice, interesting way to start off thinking about these things, not from the perspective that some things are, not suitable for scientific study or whatever, but actually to see everything on a kind of a level playing field. So that gives him the scope then to explore, deeper into various things that he finds interesting. And, his overall argument is that if we want to understand, reality or existence as a whole, then we can look at, any different, like lots and lots of different aspects of it, not just the stuff that, the physicists and chemists or whatever biologists are working on in their laboratories, but we can also look to, other things as well, like, for example, paranormal experiences, damned facts, all of these mysteries that he liked to catalogue. All of these he thought could give us an insight, or they were a gateway into understanding the bigger picture. So he has this nice quotation: "We shall pick up an existence by its frogs. If there is an underlying oneness of all things, it does not matter where we begin, whether with stars or laws of supply and demand, or frogs or Napoleon Bonaparte. One measures a circle beginning anywhere." Okay, so, this is the kind of approach that I'm trying to bring at this. We can, paranormal experiences, extraordinary experiences are often marginalized and, viewed as something that, academics should steer clear of and all those kind of things. But I think actually they're a part of the bigger picture, and we can learn about bigger issues by investigating these things. So this is my general approach, and this is what I take from Charles Fort. Another thing that I take from Charles Fort is his willingness to explore wild ideas and to entertain different kinds of hypotheses. So he would come up with all of these extraordinary theories that would give possible explanations for his damned facts. Okay, so a couple of examples of things like his idea of the Super Sargasso Sea, which is like a place that he hypothesized where things, when things disappear, or like Bermuda Triangle that kind of thing, that there's this place where all of these things just disappear and they reappear in that place, which is a crazy idea and obviously is not a very scientific idea, but it's an interesting possibility. There could be some other dimension or a repository, in space-time or something where things pop in and out of, we don't know. Quantum physics is pretty weird. Things can exist in multiple places at the same time. So, it's interesting. He also thought about this idea of, phenomena in the world, the things that we see around us and also ourselves, I guess, and the other kinds of animals and stuff that exist, that we might actually be phantoms in a supermind, that we are actually dream characters in a dream of some kind of superorganism. But we'll come back to this idea of thinking about superorganisms later on. But, he would come up with these wild ideas. And they're interesting because they shed new light or new perspectives. They give us a new angle for thinking about things that we might otherwise just ignore. But, he was also keen to point out that all of these ideas are to be taken with a pinch of salt. And he says, "I believe nothing of my own that I have ever written. I cannot accept that the product of minds as subject matter for beliefs." So, he's basically saying that any kind of human thought or idea, we can't rely on that. We can't put our faith in that. They're all, Robert Anton Wilson talked about these things as gambles or approximations. Human ideas are just that. They are gambles or approximations of what's going on. It's not the exact truth or the exact, it's not reality as a whole. It's just a model. So yeah, so these other ideas are interesting. So with this kind of Fortean approach in mind, you know, bearing in mind that we're not going to be able to work this whole thing out, and that's not what the point of this is, but also, you know, being open to exploring wild ideas and other possibilities, we're going to go into what I want to talk about now, which is how an organic view of the world might be a better way of understanding things like the paranormal than a sort of mechanistic and reductionist way of thinking, which is actually the dominant view in much of sort of sciences, but also in the social sciences and humanities as well. So we'll have a look at these ideas now. So let's go. Oh, should also mention, yeah, that these ideas are kind of all threads that have been working through things that I'm currently writing or have written recently. So a lot of these ideas emerged out of the book Greening the Paranormal, which was published in 2019, which is kind of exploring the ecological green undercurrents within paranormal experiences of various different kinds. Manifesting the Spirits is my PhD thesis, which has just been published as a book. And in that I explore spirit mediumship and all of the different ways that we might think about mediumship from an anthropological perspective, but ultimately argue that we need to approach it from a holistic kind of non-reductive perspective, and a perspective that focuses on processes. And then the third book along here, Mattering the Invisible, will be coming out later on this year, is an edited collection with Dr. Dina Espirito Santo. And it's really exploring different ways of thinking about the role of matter in mediating paranormal experiences, but also the way that humans use matter to think about other kinds of invisible things, you know, like weather systems and whatever. That's very interesting stuff. But in my chapter in that, I explore this vitalist kind of ecological, biological strand in psychical research. So what I'm going to talk to you about now kind of draws from all of these different perspectives, and also from a few of my ideas about Charles Fort and his writings. So I hope you find it interesting. So we'll start off with first principles and think about the difference between a mechanistic and an organicist way of thinking about the world. Okay, and it's interesting here because I'm going to look at an idea from David Hume. And, you know, David Hume is a pioneer of, you know, real rationalist skeptical approach. And he was very dismissive of all sorts of religious experiences and things like that. So it's not often that I find myself in agreement with him. But actually, he has this idea, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I do agree with him with. But this idea emerged from this other argument that was put forward by William Paley. And you may have encountered William Paley's watchmaker argument for the existence of God. But the basic idea is that, you know, if we look at the world around us, at the way that our bodies work and all of those kind of things, the way that ecosystems function, well, he wasn't thinking in those terms, it looks as though it's been put together by a creative designer. You know, physical bodies, our bodies work with lots of different parts that interact with each other. So it's almost like a machine or a mechanism. So he says that in his famous watchmaker argument, that if you're walking along the beach and you picked up a watch, you'd look inside, you'd see the mechanism, and you'd think someone had designed this. And the same goes for the world around us. So his argument is that it's so intricately designed, like a watch mechanism, that God must have created it. But David Hume rejected this idea on a very interesting ground, that if we do actually look at the world, and this is his words, the world plainly resembles more an animal or a vegetable than it does a watch or a knitting loom. Its cause, therefore, it is more probable, resembles the cause of the former. The cause of the former is generation or vegetation. The cause, therefore, of the world we may infer to be something analogous to generation or vegetation. Okay, so he's saying that it's not like the world has been put together like a watch mechanism, like cogs being fitted together or anything like that, but it's more like the world has emerged or grown in the same way that a plant or a vegetable, or any kind of other organism would grow. It doesn't, even the physical body, the mechanism, we want to use that word, is not the same as a watch mechanism. You can see, for example, atrophied limbs and stuff, and spandrels. It's obviously evolved through a process. So this is what David Hume was arguing, that the world is more organic than William Paley was making it out to be. It's also quite a Fortean kind of idea. We can think about the world as a vegetable. It's got a nice kind of humor to it as well, which is good. So yeah, it's not often that I agree with David Hume about some things, but in this case, I like this idea, and it seems to work, that the world is organic. So we start then from an organic perspective rather than a mechanistic perspective. What kind of things emerge? Okay, so the mechanistic view is really epitomized by materialism, which is the idea that matter is the fundamental building block of reality, and that if we want to understand the world, we can do it through reductionist methods, which is basically breaking the world apart, chopping it up, getting down to the finer subatomic particles, and then we've solved the mystery of reality. And this is the idea that comes, that is essentially fueling, the search for subatomic particles at CERN and those kind of things. The idea that we can understand reality by breaking it down to its constituent parts. Organicism, on the other hand, takes a slightly different perspective. So instead of looking at the way that things are kind of put together from the bottom up, from the smallest parts upwards, it looks at the holistic perspective first and considers that might actually have primacy. So it's not like it's the bottom up that's driving it, but actually it's, or maybe the bottom up is driving, but it's moving towards a greater complexity. And it's the complexity that is the interesting thing. So here's a nice quote from Rupert Sheldrake, who himself adopts a kind of organicist view. He says, the philosophy of organicism denies that everything in the universe can be explained from the bottom up, as it were, in terms of the properties of subatomic particles or atoms or even molecules. Rather, it recognizes the existence of hierarchically organized systems which, at each level of complexity, possess properties that cannot be fully understood in terms of the properties exhibited by their parts in isolation from each other. Each level of the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So, they're saying that the complexity that arises out of this is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just a byproduct or an epiphenomenon or anything like that. From an organicist perspective, it is the whole that is important, understanding what that whole is. Okay, so there are these two broad perspectives then, mechanism and organicism. And it's interesting that when we look at the history of psychical research and parapsychology, it's actually the mechanistic view that has been dominant, and actually the mechanistic view has been dominant throughout most, mainstream science. So it's kind of unsurprising that, psychical research as a field that's striving to make itself, recognized and established as a real discipline, should try to adopt the sort of mechanistic and technological, maybe metaphors of dominant science. Okay, so way back in the 19th century, spiritualists, psychical researchers, parapsychologists employed technical or technological metaphors to understand paranormal phenomena. So there are things that we've probably all heard about, like the spiritual telegraph, or more recently ideas about the brain as a radio receiver kind of thing, or a television set, drawing on Aldous Huxley kind of reducing valve ideas, where the brain is like a machine essentially. Or the idea that, you know, the brain is a receiver of consciousness that can tune into consciousness, like on a dial or something like that, or that spirits, you know, we tune into spirits, that kind of thing. So there's been a lot of this use of a kind of technological, mechanistic kind of metaphor for understanding mediumship. And they've often borrowed from, you know, what's called the queen of the hard sciences. So from physics, ideas from physics. So especially ideas of forces, waves, fields, rays, all of that kind of stuff. And I think we could even say that we've got this image here. So I'll just jump forward. This image here of J.B. Ryan and his parapsychology, you know, his refinement of psychical research in the 20th century into scientific parapsychology, but really taking its inspiration from, you know, fields like behaviorism. Although he isn't a behaviorist himself, you know, his approach to doing science in a laboratory with very simple procedures is a very behaviorist kind of reductive approach. And I've argued elsewhere that, you know, bringing psychical research into the lab has meant that we've lost sight of the bigger context and of the sort of the way that these experiences occur in the real world. Others have argued it as well, obviously. Okay, so you can see how this kind of reductionist, mechanist kind of model has been active in psychical research and parapsychology, even if obviously their ideas are way beyond standard materialist mechanist frameworks. You know, they're still applying and using the scientific method understood in a reductionist way, which is interesting. But, you know, there are other researchers who have taken inspiration from this organismic strand that also exists, you know, probably goes way back, and have used ideas from biology rather than physics, for example, to what we might call matter the paranormal, to understand the paranormal in terms of matter. Okay, so they use concepts and ideas from biology, ecology, and things like that to try and understand the paranormal rather than from maybe physics and mechanistic, you know, science. So there's a few little examples are people like Charles Richet. He was himself a Nobel Prize winner, and you know, his work was based in physiology. So he's obviously coming from the perspective of biology, cellular biology, and those kind of things. And in his work, his research into things like, you know, physical mediumship and stuff like that, he drew on his background in biology, physiology, and introduced new terms into psychical research. So it's from Charles Richet that we get the idea of ectoplasm, for example, which is directly taken from cellular biology. If you look at a diagram of the cell, the ectoplasm is the stuff inside it that can come out in pseudopods. So when it's, yeah, pseudopods, again, another word from cellular biology, which is when the ectoplasm comes out through the cell membrane and forms a new kind of limb, a pseudopod, kind of like, yeah, a limb. So that's the idea. So, you know, he's using his understanding of cellular biology rather than, say, physics or whatever, to make sense of the paranormal phenomena that he observed in seances with physical mediums. So it adds an interesting dimension to it. It brings, you know, for example, ectoplasm and physical mediumship into the realms of biology and of cellular, you know, cellular processes and that kind of thing. It's a very different way of thinking, rather than energies and that kind of thing. Hans Driesch is another example. He was a vitalist biologist, and vitalism essentially is the idea that there's a kind of like a life force that flows through all things, and it is this life force that ultimately gives, well, life to matter. Okay, so there is this fundamental living essence. And his idea was, again, thinking about things like physical mediumship that these might be what he called super extended physiological processes. It's such a really cool idea that, you know, paranormal or extraordinary mind-body manifestations are just extensions of otherwise normal processes that go on within our bodies all the time, normal biological processes. Okay, so he says, in fact, normal organizatory and constructive assimilation, as it appears, for instance, in regeneration. So in the way that, you know, if we cut ourselves, we can heal. It's a process of matter forming a new, you know, structure, isn't it? Would have to be amplified only in regards to its effect. You know, so basically he's saying that our body's ability to heal itself is a form of materialization, or, you know, even our body's ability to grow and change over time is a form of materialization, which is really interesting. So then psychical, you know, physical mediumship materializations are just an extension of that process that our bodies are already capable of doing naturally. So he says small and big are always relative notions. You know, but it's extraordinary that our bodies can heal in that way. You know. Okay, so he's saying then that materialization is essentially a supernormal embryology. You know, it's the same kind of processes that go on within an embryo that's growing and developing and changing over time, but super extended, you know, perhaps outside the limits of the body, things like that. Very interesting, different way of thinking about it, you know, rather than thinking about the medium as some kind of like a computer or a vessel that somehow is like projecting or transmitting, you know, rays or waves or forces of spirit or something. But actually these are more like, it's an organic biological manifestation. And again, you're not saying that this is, you know, don't obviously take it with a pinch of salt and take it in a Fortean spirit, but, you know, these are interesting ideas to think about. And then Rupert Sheldrake is probably a more recent example of the role or this organicist current in contemporary parapsychology. So especially his work on things like morphogenetic fields, this idea that there are these, you know, biological fields essentially that help to shape our development and growth, you know, why we have the bodies shaped that we have and all those kind of things. So again, and we saw Sheldrake's definition of organicism earlier, but he's drawing on his own understanding of, you know, microbiology and that kind of thing, embryology and whatever, to understand paranormal processes. Okay, so what I want to do now for the last part of this talk is to apply some organic principles or ideas to some of my own research, or to try and think about how they might help to elucidate some of these processes that we call paranormal. So I want to do this, first of all, in the context of my own research, my own PhD research on physical spirit mediumship in Bristol, recently published in this book. And what I found was that my experience of mediumship didn't match up with a kind of reductive or mechanistic idea of the medium as a receiver. In fact, what I observed was something that was much more like a gradual process. You know, the process of becoming a medium wasn't like, although sometimes it happens for people that, you know, they just all of a sudden discover this ability, but for the mediums that I interacted with, it was actually a gradual process of learning to do this. And also the process of bringing spirits into the seance room was not like tuning into a spirit and then you had a nice clear signal. It was much more like a gradual process of nurturing and development. It took a long time. It might actually have taken, you know, weeks, months, or even years for particular spirit personality to become a very, well-developed and established voice, with a strong sense of presence. It would usually start off, like the medium would make small gurgling sounds or things like that, or they might twitch in a certain way. And then I elaborate on this in the context in the book, but the circle leader picks up on these little twitches, hones in on them, and says, like, okay, I see you're trying to communicate there. Can you, do it again? And gradually build up a dialogue. So it's more like a nurturing process, a very kind of slow and encouraging kind of thing that's going on, rather than tuning in or, setting the controls within the medium to whatever quadrant of the galaxy you want to communicate with. It's not like that. It's more like a gradual process of development and of gently encouraging them to come through in the context of this, social ritual. It's interesting as well that, these ideas, or this idea of manifesting spirits through a gradual social process, has also been noted by other anthropologists in different cultural contexts. So there's a very interesting ethnography by an anthropologist called Nurit Bird David, where she talks about Nayaka, who are this tribal group in India, and their relationship with Devara spirits, which are sort of like nature spirits that dwell in trees. But they possess people's bodies occasionally, deliberately. But the process of communicating with the Nayaka, with the Devara, is a very kind of gradual one that involves dialogue, conversation, gentle encouragements, and the spirits and the people kind of have these quick exchanges with each other where they tease each other but gradually build up. Okay, so the whole process of making these entities socially real is kind of like more of a nurturing kind of organic process. Okay, so this is what I observed in my field work. So I'm thinking now, what happens if we do apply these more kind of process-oriented perspectives, more biological angles or organic angles? And I found this nice quote from Alistair Hardy, who was himself a marine biologist, who became interested in religious experience. And this was his angle on it. I think this is the kind of angle that I'm thinking with this application of an organic approach. So he says, I will confess that perhaps my main interest in ecology is the conviction that this science of interrelationships of animals and their environment will eventually have a reaction for the benefit of humankind. I believe that one of the great contributions of biology this century will be the working out of ecological principle, ecological outlook. So what I'm doing now is taking this idea of an ecological outlook and applying it to, problems of the paranormal, or to make sense of, ethnographic experience of mediumship and that kind of thing. So what does it look like coming from an organicist, ecological perspective rather than a mechanist, reductionist perspective? So one, as I've just hinted at when you're talking about my own experience, one thing that we might look at, as a principle within nature, or as an ecological principle that could apply to things like this, is the idea of process. So we see process in nature through growth, the idea of development. Ecosystems start off simple and they become more complex. We start off as two cells. We multiply into many cells in the form of a body. It's a feature of living things. Life is process, essentially. And it doesn't matter whether we zoom in to the very tiny world, bacteria and the tiniest forms of life, or whether we look at the big world of us, megafauna, these processes are still there. So, it seems to be a principle of living organisms. So again, rather than adopt this technological model of mediumship, of the medium as a receiver or and it's something like that, why not think in terms of organic processes like growth? So that this is a process, it's a development. And especially in the manifestation of these experiences as well, you know, as a paranormal experience happens, it's not something that just pops out of nowhere. Usually, I mean, it might appear like that at the point of manifestation, but usually, you know, when we look at case histories of, you know, UFO abductees or poltergeist experiences or whatever, there are events that lead up to these, you know, psychic events, relationship events, all of that kind of stuff. So it's a process that gradually builds. And Edith Turner makes an interesting use of the idea of carving, you know, of birth, like when a baby cow is born, and it just falls out, doesn't it? She uses this example in her discussion of the Ihamba ritual that she participated in. I won't go into detail about Edith Turner's background, but she's a very interesting character that I recommend you check out. But she participated in this ritual in Zambia, the purpose of which was basically a kind of like an exorcism to extract a malignant spirit from the body of an afflicted patient. And at the climax of the ritual, and she describes all of the processes that build up to this climax, which is why it's such an important kind of ethnographic account, and why it frames this idea of process quite nicely. She describes the way that the, you know, tensions and emotions build and ebb and flow, and then there's like a release, and then gradually it builds up more until finally, at the end of the ritual, this you know, hours-long ordeal, I suppose, there is a birth or an eruption of, you know, the paranormal. So he says, and just then through my tears, the central figure swayed deeply. All leaned forward. This was indeed going to be it. I realized along with them that something was now going to be born. Then a certain palpable social integument broke and something carved along with me. I felt the spiritual motion, a tangible feeling of breakthrough going through the whole group. And the whole group in this process of manifestation or whatever saw this grey ectoplasmic kind of blob being extracted from the back of the afflicted patient, and they cap it in a jar, and when they look inside, there's a human tooth in there, which is a whole part of the idea that when this spirit is in the body, it takes the form of a human tooth and moves around, causing distress. So, you know, this idea of the ritual process as a birthing process, bringing this, manifesting this, or, you know, bringing it into social reality is quite an interesting one. And it makes you have to means that you have to consider, you know, all of the psychological, physiological processes that are going on as well that ultimately lead to any kind of a paranormal experience. Okay, so that's interesting. Process growth. Another natural principle seems to be symbiosis. There is, of course, the opposite of symbiosis as well, parasitism, which brings about a whole load of other interesting perspectives, you know, on the paranormal in relation to, you know, alien abductions and negative experiences, vampires and whatever. But we'll stick with symbiosis for now. So Lynn Margulis was the co-creator of the Gaia hypothesis with James Lovelock. And her basic idea was that symbiosis is a fundamental organic principle. And that actually, you know, the evolution of complex life forms was dependent on, you know, symbiosis as a fundamental part of what it means to be alive, and of how these complex systems have emerged. And so I think, you know, if symbiosis is a principle that runs through nature, then we can also apply this idea to other domains of nature. So mycorrhizal fungi are a really good example of this, and probably very, very popular at the moment, the idea of fungi and of the networks and things. Merlin Sheldrake's recent book is very popular. You know, but it's interesting because the network itself is a sort of liminal entity. Symbiosis is a relationship between two things, but it creates again something that's more than the sum of its two parts. So this network of that exists, we hear about the Wood Wide Web, for example, that enables communication between trees, facilitated by fungi in a symbiotic relationship. Well, that is enabling a more complex system to emerge. But that system itself is liminal. It exists between the fungus and the root system of the plants. So, can we apply this idea of symbiotic relationships and of emergent phenomena from those relationships to things like mediumship and so on, or to the mind-body relationship, for example? If symbiosis is a fundamental natural principle, then mind and body, they may be separate things, but they may be symbiotically connected in some way. Or it might lead us down, the roots of thinking in terms of a sort of panpsychism or animism. That minds are the product of relationships between different things. Lots of interesting possibilities. And of course, in the context of spirit mediumship, well, it then reveals that, if this principle does apply, that spirits and mediums sort of mutually sustain one another. They're in some kind of a symbiotic relationship in the moment of trance. And again, like a mycorrhizal network, the medium then becomes, it's kind of embodied in the idea of a medium, a liminal entity, a meeting point, in the same way that the fungus and the root system meet, or the way that a lichen functions. A lichen this is a wonderful lichen in my garden, a trumpet lichen. That is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and algae, with algae which can photosynthesize, and that's how these extraordinary entities that are a combination of two different things living together and mutually sustaining each other opens up, a lot of interesting ways for thinking about things like mediumship and the mind-body relationship. That perhaps it's a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship between two different forms of organism. It's taking a Fortean approach, and who knows what's going on, but we can explore these ideas, can't we? It's interesting to note that Charles Fort himself dabbled in these intermediate territories, liminal territories, and he had this idea of transmediumization. He says, "Can one's mind, as I shall call it, affect one's own body, as I shall call it? If so, that is personal witchcraft or internal witchcraft. Can one's mind affect bodies of other persons and other things outside? If so, that is what I call external witchcraft." So he's blurring again the lines between internal and external, between mind and matter. Transmediumization from his perspective is, the relationship of, well, here we go. I've got another great quote for you here. This is how he defines transmediumization, meaning the passage of phenomena from one medium of existence to another. I mean, the imposition of the imaginary upon the physical, some sort of a relationship between two different orders or organisms, maybe. But I mean, not the action of mind upon matter, but the action of mind-matter upon matter-mind. This is like some kind of a panpsychist thing, but we're like relating, we're forming a relationship with matter, or with the stuff that exists. So I think, some of Fort's ideas as well could well fit into this little kind of symbiotic kind of relationship way of thinking about the paranormal. And then the last thing I want to touch on is a much broader concept that has emerged out of ecology and biology, and that is the idea of systems and complexity. So, we've all heard of the ecosystem, for example. The idea is that the world around us consists of relationships between living organisms. So, predator-prey relationships, or the relationship between, plant eaters and plants. They are relationships between living organisms, but also between organisms and the non-living environment. So the carbon cycles, the water cycles, all of those kind of things. So from a systems perspective, everything is interconnected. Yeah, the living and the non-living are interconnected through all of these different processes. Living things need nutrients and stuff that they extract from non-living systems, but then they give back into non-living systems through processes of respiration and so on, moving gases around and things, and decomposition. So the systems view is a very complex perspective, but it's saying that this complexity is the important thing. It's not reducing it down to the constituent parts that's important, but it's actually the emergent complexity that is the thing we should be interested in. Okay, and it's interesting to note that ecosystems, one of the first systems that we identify in the world, tend towards increased complexity through this process of succession. And succession is basically how, you might start off with a bare rock ground, and then you might have a seed that lands in the ground and slowly breaks it up, which changes the soil profile and makes it easier for other less hardy plants to grow. And eventually, you end up with a rainforest, a climax vegetation. So it's interesting that there seems to be this move in nature towards increased complexity as well. Okay, so again, ecosystems are more than the sum of their parts. It's not understanding it in terms of its individual components, although of course they're important, but actually the relationships between those individual components are key. So we can't reduce it down. It's the whole that's significant. So, a very easy way to apply this to my own field work, and actually this is a conclusion that I came to, was that a séance, for example, is much more than the sum of its parts. So, we could try, and this is the standard approach in a lot of anthropology, for example, to reduce it down to its essential components, to say that, for example, it performs the function of, being a release for people, or it is a way of dealing with stress, or a way of dealing with bereavement and things like that. But actually, when you participate in a seance, it's more than that. It's not just that. So the point is that, we can think about something like a seance, which is usually explained away or debunked, in terms of fraud or whatever, but we can look at it also as a larger system and consider that even, within those things where there are these individual processes going on, maybe including fraud and trickery, but that there might also be emergent phenomena that come out of that are more than the sum of their parts. So, for example, the experiences that people have in seances, extraordinary experiences that transform people's lives, but that are not adequately explained in terms of, delusion or trickery or fraud or anything like that. So actually, these experiences that emerge in these contexts could be considered more than the sum of their parts. Okay, so what we can also say is that, from the perspective of complexity, that when it's not going to be a simple explanation, we're not going to be able to reduce mediumship down to, a purely physiological explanation, or we're not going to be able to reduce it down to a purely, mental explanation, or purely to spirits or whatever. It's not just a social phenomenon, it's not just a cultural phenomenon, but actually it's like a knotting together, in the same way that these mycelial networks knot together of lots of different kinds of processes. It's like a mediumship is a knotting place, or the seance is a knotting place of different psychological processes, physiological processes, social processes, cultural ideas, not to mention all of the possible, spiritual, transpersonal kinds of processes that are going on as well. So it doesn't make sense to just assume that it is all fraud, for example. Fraud may well play a role in there, but the complexity of the whole is much more interesting. So that's just another way that we might apply these broader ecological, biological systems kinds of views to the paranormal. It's also interesting, there we go. So for example, like James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, is a model of this kind of complexity. But there are all sorts of debates within, Gaia theory about what the nature of this complexity is. So yes, there is the Earth is a complex system, but is this complex system alive? Is it self-directed in some way? Is it conscious? All of these kind of things. And science is having a great deal of difficulty, I think, in dealing with this issue, because the tendency is to dismiss any kind of sentience in nature or any kind of sense of teleology, the idea that things might be directed towards a particular goal, because it implies, intentionality and consciousness in nature. So, coming to the idea also leaves open, room for debates as well. There's a lot of debate about it. But interestingly, people like Charles Fort and John Keel also picked up on this, but from a completely different angle. So while ecologists and those kind of guys pick up on the complexity of ecosystems through investigating the relationship between, for example, like lichen and moss, or, the relationship between starfish and sea urchins or something. Remember back to when Charles Fort said that we can, we start measuring a circle anywhere. But these guys, Fort and Keel, come to similar kinds of ideas of the world being a complex, holistic system from investigating the paranormal and collecting together these damned facts. So this is one of the things that I find really interesting about this, is how there is this overlap or convergence between ecological perspectives on the world, resulting in this image of a complex whole, and paranormal perspectives on the world, which similarly come to a similar kind of conclusion. So Fort suggests that the oneness that he detected that underlying all of his damned facts might be thought of as a kind of like a living system. Okay, and he talked about a cosmic organism. And he also goes to the extent of, maybe this possesses some form of purposive intelligence, that there might be a reason behind paranormal experiences, which is interesting. For example, like we saw with his idea of phantoms in a dreaming mind. We run into the same kind of issues as we do with the Gaia hypothesis. Is this all, is this crazy complexity the product of an intelligence, or is it the product of chance, or whatever, blind mechanism, or something else? And John Keel took up this idea as well. He suggested the possibility that the Earth might actually be a living organism. Here's his lovely quote. He says, "It's quite possible, even probable, that the Earth is really a living organism, and that it in turn is a part of an even larger organism, that whole constellations are alive, transmitting and receiving energy to and from other celestial energy sources. Up and down the energy scale, the whole macrocosm is functioning on levels of reality that will always be totally beyond our comprehension. We're a part of it all, just as the microbe swimming on the microscope slide is unknowingly a part of our dismal reality. And like the microbe, we lack the perceptive equipment necessary to view the larger whole. Even if we could view it, we could not understand it." Pretty potent stuff. But it's very interesting, isn't it, how people like John Keel and Charles Fort come to this idea of a very complex world of interconnected things that may in fact be alive. And so do ecologists, coming from a very matter-of-fact kind of physical, biological angle. So I think that just about kind of wraps up where we're at now. Could these insights of paranormal researchers and the insights of ecologists be glimpses of the same thing? They could well be. Let's keep our Fortean minds open with that one. So my conclusions are that research on parapsychological phenomena and experiences has tended towards reductive and mechanistic models and explanations, but that actually there has been a thread throughout parapsychology and psychical research of organicist ways of thinking, and that actually these organicist models might provide, holistic alternatives that can shed new light on old problems, like the mind-body problem or the problem of spirit mediumship and that kind of thing. So thinking of mediumship, for example, in terms of process, symbiosis, and systems, opens up new avenues for investigation and new interpretations of things that might have been dismissed in very simplistic terms previously. And then overall, adopting a Fortean approach to research in the paranormal or in religion or in whatever field that we're investigating can bring a kind of like a freedom to explore novel perspectives and age-old problems. And that doesn't mean that we have to adopt all of those ideas wholeheartedly, but we can explore them in an open-minded way. We can challenge established ideas with new models, and we can take what works and leave what doesn't. So there we go. Here's a bunch of references for you if you want to follow up on any of this stuff. And I hope very much that you found it interesting and that I wasn't too rambling. And if you've got any questions or comments that you would like to send me, that you can get in touch via my email address, which is jack.hunter@uwtsd.ac.uk. So yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.
Thank you very much, Jack. Very interesting and informative talk. So for anyone who doubts that a Fortean approach is the appropriate one to take in research, I urge you to, think about what you've just heard. As I've said, Jack's got a number of books, so please feel free to pop along to Amazon or various other sources and buy those books. You can order them in if they're not already present in bricks and mortar shops. I think they're all open at the moment, so support your local businesses as well. And thank you everyone for supporting Edinburgh Fortean Society by coming along and viewing this talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I certainly have. So thank you very much, Jack, and thank you everyone else, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.